nobody has a problem with those big highfalutin concepts, but man, it becomes really scandalous when you really start to conceive of the fact that God can become a human being very much like you. Once upon a time in my Presbyterian days, I was one of the usual examiners for candidates to ordination. And we would have a written exam, we would have an exam that was kind of an oral exam in committee, and then we would ask candidates to be publicly examined. So you would have to come up in front of all the clergy, basically what would be in our parlance, all the clergy of the diocese. And you would have to be asked questions. And one of the token questions that I would always ask is what do you mean by the incarnation? And it was amazing that students every once in a while, guys that had been through seminary, been through 4 years, and learned their Christology and knew their stuff, would fall all over themselves. That Jesus was a man, but not like us. And you wouldn't flunk a guy just for that, but that's actually a heresy. That when he says he was like us in all things except sin, it meant that Jesus needed a strong roll-on antiperspirant and some toothpaste, or he would be reeking. and that idea is sort of, oh my, it seems so offensive. But if you don't have that as the necessary implication of your faith, the Christian faith becomes suddenly utterly unintelligible. The whole importance of the resurrection is premised on the fact that Jesus wasn't kind of God, kind of a human being, or mostly human, or somehow, but that he was actually factually
fully human, fully divine.
Yeah. And so that becomes a really important part of our faith. But as you can see, this retelling of the story of Genesis, this borrowing of some of the conceptual furniture from Proverbs, the ability to reach out and kind of grab on to some of the precedents in Jewish literature, but also to hang on to some furniture that's lingering in the room because of the Greeks, becomes a really, really wonderful way to sort of pull all of this together as a really nice, fat, thick overture before John actually launches out and starts to tell the story of the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And it's one of the reasons why, if you're really wanting to introduce somebody to the Christian faith, you could do a lot worse than handing them a copy of the Gospel according to John. And this continual emphasis on the God becoming incarnate, God with meat, has all of these really interesting connections throughout John's Gospel, including to things like, eat my flesh and drink my blood, as Jesus says in John 6. It makes sense of what's going on in the resurrection at the end of the Gospel. The God of very God can communicate himself to you under the form of his life-giving flesh and his saving blood. That becomes all this, all of a sudden this stuff all starts to kind of hold together. But it's important to see that this becomes a conceptual backdrop, so that if the doctrine of the Trinity didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. Because he's with God, he is God. In the beginning, he's with God, not precisely identical to God in the sense that Father, Creator, is the same as Son, but yet not independent, of him. All things were made through him. All things were made by him. So you have this hints at differentiation in the persons of God, but also in the unity of the strong solidarity of the Word with God. Kind of, jumping right back into some of the themes that we started to develop last week, right? So, what do we end up with? And when at the end, when you take all of the biblical precedents together as a whole, and all the places where you get hints and explicit statements, and we've just hit some of the highest of the high points, what do you end up with as biblical teaching understood as a distilled whole? Well, this is the easiest way that I can conceive of to talk about the Trinity, to think about the Trinity, and to present it to someone. You know, if you've got somebody just trying to get their arms around this for the first time. I know it works because it worked with my 11-year-old this week. trying to teach her the mysteries of the doctrine of the Trinity. She's got the worst Catholic textbook ever. You know, I mean, it's giving her these giant, portions that she's got memorized from the adult catechism. And she says, what makes the Father, Father, and the Son, Son? And she's having to go into these really, really elaborate themes. The Father is unbegotten, and the Son is begotten, and the Spirit is eternally proceeding. And just very, you're saying, okay, well, how do you distill this down to where an 11-year-old can wrap her brain around it? First of all, it's a mystery. You're not going to get it all. You're not going to be able to explain it, and it's not going to be perfectly clear. But you can begin to sort of shape out the mystery, frame it out in 3 affirmations. The first one is that there is one God from all eternity. The Shema, every day Jews get up, Shema Yisrael, Adonai, Elohim, Adonai, Echad. God is one. There aren't many gods. We might be able to talk in veiled hints about a second power in heaven. There's some complexity there to be sure. But at the end, you can't really say anything more than that there is one God. As a matter of fact, you can't read the prophets of Israel, Isaiah and Amos, and these important figures, yelling all the time about the idolatry of the Israelites. That only makes sense if there are no other God but the one God. So that's basic truth number 1. Second is a little bit more developed. That the Father is eternally God. You read from the earliest chapters of Genesis on down to Revelation, and you don't get the sense that the Father is anything other than eternally God. The same is true of God the Son. Remember last week, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. In John's Gospel here that we just went through, the same was in the very beginning with God and was God. So always this implication that the Son is eternally. There was never a time when the Son wasn't God. And the third is that the Holy Spirit is eternally God. We didn't get a whole lot into the divinity of the Holy Spirit in the New Testament, but in every place, whether the Spirit is called the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Christ, or the Spirit is simply spoken of as God, you get this impression that this is not something that happened at some point, that the Spirit has always been God, because to be anything other than eternally God is to be a demigod, a derivative of God, right?
That's something that, I've taken tons of these classes, but that's something that always comes up. God the Father is always discussed.
Yeah.
God the Son is always discussed. This much.
Yeah.
The Holy Spirit, and you're always going, okay. Somebody will mention it, you're like, okay, here we go, and then move on.
Yeah.
Why is this? It's the least elaborated on of the 3, always.
Right. Well, There are a couple reasons for this. One of them is sort of quantity of material. The quantity of material about the divinity of Jesus, there's a big chunk of it. And the references to the Spirit are always there, from the very first part of Genesis, the Spirit of God was upon the face of the waters, the present with God. The really great connection last week, I think, that you were making between Proverbs, and you said, this doesn't sound so much like Jesus as it sounds like the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. And I went, it's a good observation and an important observation that the Spirit and wisdom are awfully close. The Shekinah, the presence of God in the temple, is likened in the New Testament to the Holy Spirit. You remember that little bit when Solomon, had the temple constructed for the first time, and they got the temple decked out and loaded with all its furniture, and the priests started to minister, and it said that the glory of the Lord, the kavod of God, the heaviness of God, the rabbis would talk about it as the Shekinah, the presence of God, the divine presence in the temple was so heavy, and that's what the word kavod means. It was so heavy that the priests literally could not stand up to minister because the presence of God was so heavy in their midst. And one of the things that signals the beginning of the exile, when in the book of Ezekiel, is that the kavod, the cloud of glory, departs from the temple and heads to Babylon. And of course, at the end of Ezekiel, the promise is that the glory, the kavod, will return. But these are images of where the Holy Spirit in this, but it's a very, very tight association. It's not differentiated so much as the Son seems to be differentiated from God. So that it's, is he talking about wisdom? Is he talking about Christ? Is he talking about the Spirit? Yeah. There's not a close differentiation. So there's a paucity of material, a really classical place where you hear about the divinity of the Holy Spirit. I mean, if you want the wind-up pitch, good proof text, it is in the book of Acts, where Ananias and Sapphira. You remember the story? They're a kind of wealthy couple, and they want the credit for having given some of the proceeds of their wealth to the church. And Ananias comes striding in, and apparently what Luke says is that he sort of sold stuff and then kept a portion of the proceeds for himself, and then kind of gave the other part to the disciples and sort of passed it off as though he was giving the whole amount. And Peter sort of gets in his face and says, now God's going to strike me dead. But what he says is that you have not lied. He says, first, you've lied to the Holy Spirit and to us. Now you're going to die. You have not lied to men, but you have lied to God. And if you're ever just sort of looking, you're in a scrape with a Jehovah's Witness who just won't accept the divinity of the Holy Spirit, you go, that's the passage in Acts. So chapter 5, I think, of Acts.
Excuse us.
I think essentially that's you're a unique person. The Jehovah's Witnesses knock on your door and you're like, come on in.
I'm waiting for you.
Yes.
That's chapter 5.
I've got chapter 5. I'm going to whip out my Bible switchblade and get into it.
Let's go.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes. So the Son, eternally God,
Is that,